Welcome to Sacred Cow Shipyards, where no ship is safe from being taken down to its nuts and bolts. You humies just love your explosions. I mean, have you ever actually stopped and thought about just how much your species seems to absolutely adore exothermic reactions? I mean, I get it. There's loud noises, there's the thump, there's the bright lights, the stuff going everywhere. I mean, it's a whole experience. I mean, it captures almost all of the senses. Well, hopefully not all of them for you. You don't want to lick explosives on average, or the residue that comes after them. But regardless, it's a kind of a whole body experience for you, I suppose. And I guess that kind of explains some of the appeal. And when I say appeal, understand that you humies love explosions so much that there is literally an event that happens every solar rotation on your planet in the USAian province of Idaho? Idaho. What a peculiar name. And what they do is they go out in the middle of a field and they make explosive targets. And then they go to the other side of the field and shoot the explosive targets. And this event has hundreds of attendees every year and goes through tons of explosives. And it's all above board and happy with the local government, from what I understand, and people pay a lot of money for the experience. They can even pay for getting up close, well, closer to the explosions and shooting them directly. Humies routinely get splattered in mud, since apparently Idaho gets very wet during this time of year, and they just do it. I mean, the whole event kicks off with a gigundo fireball being set off. They use gallons and gallons and gallons of gasoline and diesel and pounds of their explosives and road flares and so on and so forth. In fact, I am told that the organizer of the event once made the somewhat amazing quote that they have to be careful not to extinguish the road flares with the gasoline. Apparently you can do that! At least if the gasoline is traveling on a high enough speed shockwave, which again, explosion, so it makes a certain degree of sense. Anyways, well, we're not actually here to talk about this particular event, and they're not actually sponsoring this episode. I'm just fascinated by the entire concept of it actually happening. I am told that registration for it has opened at boomershoot.org, if that's your kind of thing, and maybe it isn't, and maybe it is. You can go find out. Why not? What I am here to talk about, aside from Humi's fascination with explosives, is how they don't really work in space. Or at least they don't work the way that Hollywood and special effects have led you to believe. And just to be clear, I'm predominantly talking about chemical explosives, like the ones that you typically put in the warheads for your weapons. I may bounce briefly off the topic of nuclear explosions, but that's probably an episode's worth of material by itself. And just to be abundantly clear, your species appears to define an explosion as the rapid expansion in volume of a given amount of matter associated with an extreme outward release of energy, usually with the generation of high temperatures and release of high-pressure gases. Likewise, subsonic explosions are generated by what's called low explosives, and they don't technically explode so much as they deflagrate, but we're not going to get into that particular detail. High explosives, when they detonate as opposed to deflagrate, generate supersonic shock waves, and that's predominantly how they are so useful. But you'll notice one particular thing in the definition of both high and low explosives. Sonic, supersonic, subsonic, blah blah blah, so on and so forth. What's the speed of sound in space again? And thereby hangs the thread. A significant utility of explosives on your planet is simply the shock wave they generate. In fact, I would argue for the longest time that was primarily what explosives were really used for. The shockwave, the impact, the force traveling through your atmosphere, knocking things down, killing things, doing whatever along its way. Now, over the years, y'all have added a little spice to that entertainment by way of, fragmentation or continuous rod warheads or fun things like that. But you're still using the force generated by the explosion to move something. That will still technically work in space, in that all of that fragmentation material that you wrap around warheads is basically in contact with the warhead. And when that explosive goes off, all of the gases that are generated from the detonation of the material will still be enough to launch those fragments out at high velocities, typically about the same velocities as you'd experience inside of an atmosphere. But that's all you're getting out of it. Those gases from that detonation will disperse so rapidly in a vacuum that there won't be any true shockwave aside from, again, the fragments going out in a spherical shell. But here's where the physics get a little screwball. If you can generate a projectile that can achieve a speed of approximately 3 kilometers per second before it impacts its target, it's already imparting energy to that target equal to its mass in TNT. Does that make sense? Basically, either you could have a chunk of TNT strapped to your target of equivalent weight as your projectile and set it off, or you could just run the projectile into it and achieve the same end result. In other words, putting explosives in the projectile doesn't actually gain you anything. And yeah, I know, for your limited terrestrial minds, 3 kilometers a second sounds really fucking fast, doesn't it? Except you have to remember that low Earth orbit in a circular orbit ranges between 7.7 and 6.9 kilometers a second already. 3 kilometers a second in space is pedestrian speed. And generating a potential warhead-carrying projectile that could achieve 30, 300, 3,000 kilometers a second in space, depending on what kind of technological base you're working with, would not be that challenging. To put it in context, a 250-kilogram slug of whatever metal you care to use, it doesn't really matter, the mass is really the only important part, traveling at 200 kilometers a second and hitting a target will have approximately a 1 kiloton yield on that target. A 1 kiloton nuclear bomb or 1,000 tons of TNT are equivalent to that 250 kilogram slug. So this is where explosives, like traditional chemical explosives, just don't make any sense in space, barring a few certain circumstances that, yes, we will get to. You don't get the shockwave. The shrapnel that it can generate, yes, will be going faster than the vehicle that was carrying them, but ideally in space, that missile or slug or projectile, whatever the hell it is already going so fast that you're actually losing impact energy by detonating it before it gets to its target, basically. Because that's how most of your modern missiles actually work. Much like your underwater torpedoes, they don't actually run into their targets anymore. I mentioned those continuous rod warheads earlier, and only because they are simply terrifying. You basically take a cylinder of rods of metal, alternate welding their ends together, and then you put a central core of explosives inside of them. So that when it gets close, when the missile carrying this continuous rod warhead gets close to its target, it basically pulls up next to it and blows itself up. And then you have this expanding sphere of metal all connected together, all flying at absurd speeds in your atmosphere and tearing things apart. The explosive isn't actually what takes out, in this case, an aircraft. It's actually that rapidly expanding ring of continuous rods. You cut the aircraft into ribbons. But that kind of thing doesn't make a whole lot of sense in space. I mean, yes, if you were just trying to do like a shotgun approach to knocking down a swarm of something, you wouldn't fire a single 250 kilogram slug and hope for a kiloton hit on one of them. You would have some sort of like scattergun effect kind of thing, but it might actually make more sense to have a rapid fire projectile launcher firing solid slugs as opposed to something that has to explode while it's out there. Again, you're losing energy by using the explosive, oddly enough. You would have done better just to take the mass of the projectile and the explosives, divvy it up into smaller projectiles, get rid of the explosives entirely, and just have more and more projectiles. Now, there are some odd, interesting instances of explosive uses on your planet that do deliberately hit the target and might actually make sense in a space environment. It really depends upon the technological bases involved and how ships are made and what kind of things are going on, but that's all beside the point. And you have to fit it into whatever story you're making, so figure that detail out, I guess. But one of my favorites from your planet, just because of its name, is the HESH round, High Explosive Squash Head. Interestingly, these are an anti-armor weapon that are not designed to actually penetrate the armor themselves. They use a plasticized explosive as the warhead payload, and when they impact on the armor, the plasticized explosive deforms and basically squishes itself up against the armor that it landed on, increasing surface area, increasing the contact patch. And then once it stops moving, it detonates. Again, this does not actually cause the front of the armor to take a significant amount of damage. What it does to the back of your old steel armor is it does something called spalling. It literally forces a massive chunk of the inside of the armor to just come flying off the inside of the armor and start bouncing around the very small tin can that is known as a tank. This, understandably, has deleterious effects upon the personnel and material inside of the tank. Now, unfortunately, HESH rounds have kind of fallen out of favor just because more and more tanks are using composite armor or reactive armor, and HESH doesn't really work well against either, but it might be interesting in a space setting. Again, it would be better just to take the mass and just slam a target with that mass instead of bother with the explosives, but perhaps your weapons aren't good enough to actually penetrate your enemy's armor directly, no matter how fast they're going so far, so you try this route instead. Just throwing that out as an option. Another potentially entertaining use of chemical explosives in space might be an explosively formed penetrator. I could see these being used predominantly as perhaps mine-type systems where they're just sitting out there and you need to be able to get a penetrator moving fast enough, quickly enough to be able to hit a ship before it can evade. But anyways, what is an explosively formed penetrator? Basically, you take a very strong case of some material, you stick some explosives in it, and then you shape a piece of metal over the top of it. And since, much like water, explosions always take the path of least resistance, it won't blow through the case, it'll instead blow out the metal in front of it. And in the process of that explosion, the metal gets deliberately formed into a shape that can penetrate armor. Along the way, it also picks up an inordinate amount of velocity, which, again, is how it does the whole penetration thing. And, of course, you have to be very careful about the geometry of the explosive, the geometry of the metal disc on top of it, the geometry of the case, blah, 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 so on and so forth. Very complicated physics. Suffice to say, it works just fine, though. One of the more entertaining uses of it on your planet are by way of either shells or bombs or missiles that drop off these little payloads over tanks. So they have little parachutes on top of them, and then basically a tank finding system built into the case. And when the parachute drifts over a tank, it sets off the explosive, and an explosively formed penetrator just comes down right through the top of the tank. Because tanks typically have far less armor on top than they do on their sides or front. So you basically just do a little tiny rod from God, only it's not coming from orbit, it's just coming from a few tens of feet overhead. But still, it works just fine. And I can't imagine going into a minefield in space where that's your problem. And technically, you could do the same thing with heat rounds, high-explosive anti-tank rounds. High-explosive anti-tank rounds are specialized forms of explosive that, when they impact on the shell of the tank, the explosion is kind of focused into this concentrated jet that is bordering on plasma. And it wouldn't actually be that hard in space to use an explosive system to create a plasma jet. The problem is, like I said, it's in space. In Atmo, Atmo helps the plasma jet stay together. In space, there's nothing to help confine it. All the little particles, highly energized particles that are just running around screaming like little madmen, would be pushing each other away constantly, so your range for a heat-type mine would be very limited. I mean, heat warheads are contact warheads on your planet for a reason, but even if you upscale them and optimize them and so on and so forth, it still won't really work the same way. And yes, I am aware of the Kasaba howitzer, that's a nuclear device, we're not talking about that yet. And then, finally, perhaps, maybe, if I stop talking at some point, the other big use for explosives in space, again, still mine-based, because, again, if you have a launching platform, you can launch something that will go faster and be more powerful than even if you put an explosive payload on it. But regardless, for a mine-based system, you could make an area denial system where if something gets close, it just explodes in a beehive of mess. And we all know how at orbital speeds, even something the size of 1 of your inches in diameter would be absolutely disastrous. But that's still kind of like a remotely triggered, not ship-based area denial system. If you want to deny area in space just the easy way, just have a ship start spraying those pellets regardless. You'll be able to put more pellets in space per payload with a direct fire method than trying to add explosives to them again. Anyways, what I'm trying to say in a really roundabout fashion is, as much as I enjoy Battlestar Galactica, the new one that is, the remastered, remade, however you want to phrase it, one, flat cannons in space make absolutely no sense at all. You would be better suited to have a minigun just slinging slugs as fast as it could. You would be able to put more projectiles in space faster, moving faster, than if you used a flak delayed explosion shrapnel kind of system. Especially once you start adding in the relative motion of the ship versus the other ship. Typically they would be heading towards each other, and then you're starting to add velocities, and it starts getting really, really exciting. I mean, the thing is, I really think that the Hume fascination with explosives in space boils down to your lack of real comprehension of how fast things in space are moving. For example, the Voyager 1 probe. It was launched on September 5th, 1977. It made news recently by being the first human-made object that actually left your solar system entirely. It is the first legitimate human-made object in interstellar space. I mean, that is just amazing. And it took it, well, how many years? Again, it was launched in 1977 to get out there. Well, right now, it's just cruising along at about 17 kilometers a second, and that's just its cruise speed. I mean, the last time it did a gravity slingshot or even had thrust or anything like that was decades ago. So imagine that if you were building a ship that was actually meant to go somewhere in some reasonable amount of time, you would definitely be wanting to go faster than 17 kilometers a second. And if the ship is already going faster than the aforementioned 3 kilometers a second necessary to just make it a trivial answer of whether I should put an explosive on it or not, well, suddenly all your projectiles get really solid and not explosive. And I know that is terribly disappointing to Hollywood, but I mean, honestly, they've already trained you that explosions look entirely different than they actually do. Well, let me rephrase. They've already trained you that military-style, weapon-style explosives look entirely different than they already do. Typically, military weapon-style explosions do not involve massive amounts of red flames and foomps and all that stuff, unless we're talking about like a Moab or something. All that energy could have been used to do something else. And most weapon-style explosions don't waste energy. They are optimized to put the most amount of hurt on the target possible. Not make a light show, not make a gasoline-style explosion, but actually just do some work. But the good news for Hollywood, just the limited good news, and as I mentioned at the very beginning, nukes do work in space. They work in very interesting ways, again, not the way you expect them to. But unlike explosives, they do actually function just fine, as long as you bear in mind a few rules. But that's a topic for another episode. And that's all from Sacred Cow Shipyards. Please be advised that any ship left on the docks for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Have a nice day.